And Willie, we start this morning with the Mark Meadows text messages. Boy, he was receiving a lot of them from members of Congress, the president's chief of staff.
Yeah, shocking stuff here, perhaps not surprising, but it remains shocking. Nearly 2 years after the January 6th insurrection, thousands of previously unseen text messages are revealing the lengths to which Republican lawmakers went in their efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Talking Points memo has obtained 2,319 texts that were turned over to the House January 6th committee earlier this year by former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. They show Meadows in conversation with at least 34 Republican members of Congress, with many of those lawmakers sharing debunked conspiracy theories about a stolen election in order to help then-President Donald Trump stay in office. In one text sent to Meadows just 3 days before Joe Biden's inauguration, South Carolina Congressman Ralph Norman writes, quote, "Our last hope is invoking martial law. Please urge President to do so." It's unclear if Meadows responded to that message. He did, however, respond to a plan to overturn the election floated by Arizona Republican Andy Biggs. After Biggs raised debunked claims that a substantial number of illegal immigrants had cast ballots, Meadows responded, quote, "I like it." The texts also show extensive efforts by Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry to have environmental lawyer Jeffrey Clark installed as Attorney General in the final days of the Trump administration. You remember Clark was dismissed by the people at the Justice Department. If we have an oil spill, we'll let you know if we need you. After responding once to that, the text exchange shows Meadows ignored multiple messages from Perry. Included in those texts, a popular right-wing conspiracy theory about an Italian defense contractor stealing the election for Democrats. These texts have not been verified by NBC News, maybe missing some context. NBC has reached out to those involved in the messages for responses. Joining us now, investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo, Hunter Walker. He's one of the reporters who reviewed those texts to Mark Meadows. Hunter, it's great to have you here with us this morning. So a couple of snapshots there from a couple of the members of Congress who are still there, by the way, and will hold real power in about a month or so. Can you just sort of give us a broad view of what these texts show? Beyond those snapshots, is that representative of what most of these members of Congress were saying to Mark Meadows?
Well, our story on the Meadows text is going to be a series that we roll out over the course of this week and perhaps beyond, because there's just so much in there. And the main takeaway, I mean, we were focused on members of Congress yesterday, but Meadows was engaging with people in local government, with right-wing activists, members of Congress, senators, House members. This was a broad plot at every level of government and really every level of the Republican Party. We see dark money groups. We see sort of street-level activists like Amy Kramer. And they were all, working together on various plans to overturn the election. The other big thing that I would point out here, and I think it's one of the most frightening thing about this message cache, is this is the tip of the iceberg. There are hints in the messages that this log that Meadows provided to the Select Committee is incomplete, particularly in his exchanges with Scott Perry. He talks about moving over to Signal, an encrypted messaging app. There are also, discussions that sort of seem to pop up out of nowhere and blatantly lack context. And, I'll break a little bit of news on Morning Joe this morning. I'm starting to become aware of multiple instances of things that should be in the log if it was complete that are not there. So what we're seeing is, a broad plot, particularly involving members of Congress, deranged conspiracy theories, questionable legal logic, and blatant authoritarianism. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
So it reads like crazy, except for the fact that it had a direct line into the White House. And you're talking about the chief of staff and Mark Meadows being receptive to some of it, at least in what we've seen, saying, I like it. We know, based on the video we've seen, the testimony we've heard during the January 6th Select Committee, that he showed extreme cowardice that day, unwilling to stand up on January 6th to Donald Trump. So what was his posture to most of this? Was he open to all these conspiracy theories? Did he take some of it to the president based on what you've seen?
He absolutely did. We're going to publish a story today that includes a specific instance where a conspiracy theory seems to have gone directly from Mark Meadows' phone to the Oval Office and Donald Trump's Twitter feed. But also one of the more chilling ones in the stories we dropped yesterday involved Brian Babin. There's a Texas congressman. And I think one of the important things about all this, these texts have come out a bit in drips and drabs, but some of the most shocking stuff was from members of Congress that the public really isn't that aware of. You know, guys like Brian Babin, Ralph Norman, Scott Perry, who were really at the center of this and in direct communication with the Trump White House, and just are sort of off the radar of even people who've really watched the January 6th investigation play out. And in this exchange with Babin, he sends Meadows just a completely, thoroughly debunked conspiracy theory, I think, about Pennsylvania. And Meadows says, already forwarded it to the DOJ. So there were official actions taking place based on these messages, which in the case of, for example, Paul Gosar, were being based on stuff from InfoWars, Revolver, a site with, you know, a founder with white supremacist ties. And in the case of Gosar, I can't even say it on air, but a blog called Some Told Me. I mean, this is where members of Congress were drawing their information.
So, Hunter, as you went through these text messages, from the asylum wing of the Republican Party, it struck me in looking through the first batch that you've put out that there are, as you just alluded to, many of the people involved are still members of Congress sitting in the House of Representatives. In the rearview mirror, as you look at what they did, they tiptoed up to sedition. They were right there at the gate of sedition. What do they do now? What do they have to say now?
Well, you know, you're making a really important point, Mike. And one thing that, you know, people should note here is some folks actually got promotions. I mean, we see Ted Budd, who's a House member now, he's moving on to the Senate. We see people suggesting this guy, John James, who was running for office in Michigan, should lead the challenge there. Right. And he, you know, lost a race in 2020 and just baselessly, you know, said the whole race in the state needed to be investigated. Well, guess what? Now he won. Right. So we're seeing this wing in some instances gain power. When I reached out to people, it was notable to me. I mean, I talked to Ralph Norman, who sent one of the most eye-popping texts calling for martial law 3 days before Biden took office. And he sort of said, oh, that was 2 years ago. Send me the text and I'll get back to you. Of course, he didn't, as though you could forget, calling essentially for troops to be sent into the streets, right? But one thing that was really striking was a lot of the members, including those that played a real leading role from what we saw in the text, Ted Cruz, Jody Hice, Jim Jordan, just totally ghosted us, right? The people who did respond were the few Republicans in the messages who were not among the 147 that voted to object to the election. And they all just sort of pointed to that. But this also showed that, you know, in the period leading up to that vote on January 6th, they were playing with fire.